Talking God with Uncle Luke. Tongue speaking hillbillies this week. Come on in. Let's check it out. Acts chapter 2, verse 1 to 15.
All the bubbas of the world, we got one mission in mind.
Welcome to the Biblical Channel. Always glad somebody is showing up. Why? Because we are convinced that talking God is a good thing. And we just want to simply have fun talking about God. We want to get you away from the bullshit to the holy shit so that you can shoot the shit and sound like you know your shit. Anywho, we follow the Bible very tightly and very well. Here, that's the name of the game. And to do that means having a lot of fun talking about God. So, in the words of Uncle Paul, rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances. That's God's will for your life in Jesus Christ. Remember, that's God's will for you in Jesus Christ. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks. So we're just trying to chime in and give people the right, kind of vein, the right way to talk about the Bible and to have a lot of fun with it, because God is the author of fun. Fun is God's idea, and these stories should be fun for us. And I think we get a little bit too uptight about them, but that's my personal opinion. So that's the aim and the ambition of this channel, is just to have a good talk and a good fun, and hopefully you get out there and talk the same. So anyhow, we're now moving. We're still in Uncle Luke because, well, we're in his second volume. And now we are up to the, what Uncle Luke started off by saying. And so Uncle Luke already let the cat out of the bag that volume 1 was basically, the life of Jesus here on earth. And volume 2 is the life of Jesus in heaven, but the pouring out of the Holy Spirit that he had been talking about is now going to be the subject. So God is still present in this world. He always is present in this world. And the Holy Spirit has always been around. So the Holy Spirit shows up in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, basically. So there's not entirely new. It's just God's way of reminding us that his presence is the number one objective for our life. So anyhow, Jesus was just quoted as saying, hey, wait for it. I promised that I would baptize you with the Holy Spirit. John baptized you with water. Remember that. But I promised you this, and so I want you to wait for it. Wait for it. Wait for it. I'm going to pour this Holy Spirit on you. And I'm wearing my Release the Kraken, t-shirt, because it just seems to go. Man, this little episode, speaking in tongues in Christianity, is just a hilarious topic, man. If you ain't following those Babylon Bee guys, you got to, because they're some of the funniest Christian guys. They're some of the funniest people on the planet. Usually Christian humor is not all that funny. These guys are hilarious. You can follow them on Instagram and, Facebook and every, available media outlet. And they have a lot of fun with the church, and making fun of the church. And I do too, because that's, hey man, we're all sinners. We say it all the time, but that's what it means. Since we're all sinners, we get to make fun of ourselves. We get to make fun of the churches. We get to make fun of the family of God, because the family of God is kind of weird and kind of funny. And when it comes to, the Holy Spirit, the day of Pentecost, the pouring out of the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, well, the church gets a little weird about it. There'll be some churches that seem to say, yeah, we'll tell you if it's speaking in tongues and if you can speak in tongues or not. We'll control the tongue speaking. And then there's other sides of the church that seem to be almost embarrassed about the whole moment, saying, yeah, that happened one time a long time ago, and we should not speak of this again. And then there's another side of Christianity that just seems to be the crazy train of Christianity. And I give them a lot of credit. They're trying to have fun, and that, and I will just tell you that, I emerged as a Christian in my late 20s, and I was a curious cat, man. I decided I was going to go to all of them. I had been to a Catholic church. I had been to Presbyterian church growing up here and there. But I decided, man, I'm going to go find out what all these people do. What makes a church different and whatnot. So I've been in the spectrum. I can't say that I've been in every single denomination, but I've been in the kinds of denominations that are basically represented today, from the crazy train to the stiff, and to the authoritative, all of that in between. I've been there. They're all the family of God. They're all the brotherhood. They're all good, but they're all mistaken and easily get the story wrong. We all do. But let's just stick with the words. If we stick with the words, then we're going to get the message. It's only when we talk about it or talk about whatever, and we're not really sticking with the words or using the words, or we're taking the words out of context, that we get ourselves in a lot of trouble. So speaking in tongues, like releasing the Kraken, baby. We're gonna talk this through, and it's a very sensible and very, I don't know, I bet you a nickel there's something that you're gonna hear today about speaking in tongues. You're like, oh wow, that's different than I've heard before. And I'm not dismissing anybody either. I'm not here, listen, the crazy train side of Christianity, I love them. I've been with them. Some of it's misleading, I think, but all in all, I think the Spirit is with them. And those who, get awfully nervous about the subject, I've been with them too, and they mean well. Everybody means well, but we're fallen human beings, and so it comes out poorly sometimes. But we'll give some helpful advice along the way, straight from the text. That's what we do. So the text itself, that's what we're talking about. And let me just open with the first paragraph there. Uncle Luke in Acts chapter 2, verse 1 is where we're going to start off. When the day of Pentecost, now that's a Jewish holiday, mind you. Pentecost is a Jewish holiday. The Christians have picked up on it. It just simply means 50 days. And it was one of the major festivals. It's a time of celebration, time of remembering the magnificent acts of God, all of these kinds of things. It comes after the Passover. So this is the moment that Jesus said, I would like you to wait for. So Jesus himself is kind of redefining the Pentecost, and that's why Christians still pick up on it, but I'm not sure you get that sense in any of the churches. When the day of Pentecost had arrived, though, let's get back to the text, they were all together, meaning all of this apostolic band, 120, plus probably of them that we were just told about. Suddenly a sound like that of a violent rushing wind came from heaven, and it filled the whole house where they were staying, and tongues like flames of fire that were divided appeared to them and rested on each one of them. Then they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in different languages as the Spirit gave them ability for speech. And then on the other side of the coin, remember, they're in Jerusalem. Jesus told them, wait in Jerusalem. So in Jerusalem, this Pentecost thing is going off. People have gathered in from all the nations. We'll get to that in a second. But there were Jews living in Jerusalem, staying in Jerusalem, devout men from all nations. Okay? Devout men from all nations are gathered in Jerusalem. And when this sound, whatever it was, occurred, the crowd came together and was confused because each one started hearing them speaking in his own language. So there's the wild, releasing of the Kraken of the Holy Spirit's effect is that, as Luke tells us, Uncle Luke is saying, that all of a sudden they could hear in their own language words about the magnificent acts of God. And then Uncle Luke, builds the scene for us that they were absolutely astounded and they were amazed. And one of the things that they're absolutely amazed with is they're saying, these people that are speaking, aren't they just Galileans? Now, you need a little help on this because Galileans were hardly the cool people. In fact, I've made this point many times. The Galileans were the rednecks and the crackers of the day, or just the hillbillies. It was literally the hill country. Galilee was the hill country in the north. And so in this case, the northerners spoke with a funny accent, and people made fun of them because they were hillbillies for the most part. And so that is behind it's a dig saying, aren't these guys Galileans? Does anything good come from Galilee? A bunch of hillbilly rednecks in our language. Okay. I mean, they're just saying these are bumpkins, man. These are hayseeds. These are hill people, man. How can we be hearing them speaking in our preferred language, dialects, and intonations, all that kind of stuff? So that is part of the spotlight. Okay. And then comes this list. It's a big list of the nations that are represented in Jerusalem. Makes good sense because I don't think enough time is spent realizing that Judaism was actually fairly popular when it came to people's religious perspective. The Jews were a very awkward group because it was hard to get in, but people did appreciate their, the way they lived life and the way that they thought about things, and the scriptures that they had, their perspective was pretty darn popular. Now, also remember that historically, God had scattered them into all of the nations. So the Assyrians had sacked Israel back in 722 BC and scattered them all over the place. That was the Assyrians' war tactic, was to move you about. So Jews ended up being all over the place. Israel ended up going everywhere, which is kind of like what God wanted them to do, but he wanted them to do that on their own, to be influencers of the nations. God had every intention from the beginning that Israel would be influencers to the nations. And we see in the storyline that they kind of do it backwards. They do it against their will. I love that the book of Jonah. I mean, it's all about how Israel, against their will, ends up doing God's will by reaching other nations. Anywho, that's part of the backdrop here, is that there are Jews in other nations, and people have joined in with the Jews because they were fairly popular. It's a very sensible religious viewpoint that, compared to the polytheistic worlds of Rome and Greece and all other nations. Really, people had, warmed up, to Israel and their scriptures, and so we call them proselytes. But that's the content. And so we are, we get this long list of, there's Mesopotamians, Cappadocians, Pontus, people from Pontus and Asia, Phrygia, Egypt, Pamphylia, Libya, Cyrene. Remember old Cyrus from Cyrene, an African, Libyan and Cyrene are African nations, Rome, and Jews and proselytes, Cretans, and Arabs. You see, this is a multicultural gathering. Don't forget the Bible was multicultural before anybody was multicultural. God is multicultural in his essence. We're the ones who make something evil out of it or overrate it. We that's just what we do as people. So anyhow, and again, we get that line. What they're hearing is the magnificent acts of God in their own language, Uncle Luke says. That is the focal point. And they are astounded and they're perplexed. They don't know what to make of this. And so a bunch of them start making fun of them. Again, what humans do, we just make fun of things that we don't understand. And they say, oh, they're just drunk. Peter will step up and say, they're not drunk. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. We'll have drinks later. But Peter says, they're not drunk. They're not drunk. And then we'll see what Peter has to say the next time. But for right now, let's just go back and really gather in some very important things that happen in this episode that Uncle Luke, Jesus himself, God himself, is putting in the spotlight. And sometimes I believe that the church has really missed what is actually in the spotlight in this passage. It's right there. I already said it. And maybe you still find yourself saying, I don't get it. I mean, no big deal, right? No, there is a big deal going on. The number one big deal that's going on, I think, because I'm a hillbilly redneck cracker guy, according to this world's viewpoint, and the Bible is consistent. God's book is consistent about his usage of, the redneck, the cracker, and I'm not talking about white people, not at all. In fact, there are no white people probably on the scene in this group at all. In fact, there was probably never white people, and until sometime later. But that's something for another time. Everybody had darker skin in this group. So what's really going on is the country bumpkins, the hayseeds, those people, and so God's hillbillies is his apostolic band of brothers and sisters. And we get that very, loudly coming through in the text, because the people are kind of like, they're like, Galileans? How are they doing this? Maybe somebody more talented could do this, maybe, but it's the Galileans that are on view. Like, come on, man, not the Galileans. Yes, the Galileans. So God's hillbilly, redneck, apostolic band of brothers and sisters, mind you, because in the previous text, we were told this is a band of brothers and sisters. The women are right there with the men, and the women are speaking in tongues and filled with the Holy Spirit, as the men are. Just because the men are going to get the spotlight, that, Uncle Peter's going to get the spotlight here in a minute, does not mean, the text tells us that the whole group is filled with this electrifying scene. And speaking of an electrifying scene, we also need to kind of unpack the reality of this tongue speaking as defined by Uncle Luke. Tongues is just speaking right here, as Uncle Luke is defining it, is just speaking different languages. In fact, the word tongues could equally be used for just language or speech, the kind of speech that we have, and saying things. So there's kind of a mashing together of these words that are much more, commonplace than what we make them. As soon as we say tongues today, we think of this whiz-bangy, strange, odd, hard to explain, kind of thing, when in fact, Uncle Luke is telling us that the event was spectacular. This wind, this violent wind, was heard. Not necessarily felt, but heard. Something like a violent wind was heard. And then what was seen was tongues. How do you see language? How do you see? I don't know. And I think they had trouble describing it, and they're just leaving it to our imagination. It was a hard to imagine scene that broke out among them. And that, and these tongues that they're seeing and feeling, kind of hearing, all at the same time, we are told by Uncle Luke, is the Holy Spirit. And it immediately charges them to start speaking. And when they're speaking, they're either speaking in different languages or they're speaking in their own language, and other people from other languages are able to hear. So Uncle Luke specifically defines tongue speaking as crossing the language barrier. This is the primary spotlight of the text for good reason. But Uncle Luke gives a very specific definition of what tongue speaking is right here in Luke chapter 2. And so whatever you think of speaking in tongues is, whatever you've heard, from your, church background, Uncle Luke defines it right here. Now, in other places, Uncle Paul will be talking about speaking in tongues. And don't forget that Uncle Luke and Uncle Paul were like best friends. They traveled together. We're going to find that out in Uncle Luke's, volume here in the book of Acts later on. He's a part of Paul's traveling group. And so they're not inconsistent in their thinking. And when Uncle Paul talks about it, he doesn't define it. He kind of assumes that we know what it is. And we can assume that he's comfortable with the way Uncle Luke defines speaking in tongues right here in chapter 2. And Uncle Paul's not even a part of this group. So number one, you have to include, in your definition, maybe it's bigger, but part of your definition of speaking in tongues is crossing the language barrier. And that is what is on the spotlight in this passage, because that's what the list of nations is forcing us to see something absolutely magnificent that God himself is doing. And what God himself is doing is gathering people to hear God's message, to hear the magnificent acts of God, as we are told, in their own languages, meaning that God, back in Genesis chapter 11, actually judged humanity for coming together against God. And when they came together against God in Genesis chapter 11, it's that famous Babel incident. And God judges the people saying, you know what? I'm going to have to spread you out and disperse you because you gather with your own view on the heavens. And so I'm going to make it more difficult for you to work together by giving you different languages. And oh, how biblically correct that is. What makes it very difficult for people to work together. And we're starting to overcome this. But God is the first one to overcome the language barrier by uniting people around hearing his words. So that too must be a part of our understanding of speaking in tongues, is that speaking in tongues right here is a magnificent moment because it is reversing the effects of Babel for the sake of uniting people around the words of God. The Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues should always be about bringing more people together to talk about God and his magnificent acts. It should be a very unifying thing, not a weirdo thing. And this is part of what Uncle Paul is talking about later in some of his letters, is that speaking in tongues is becoming cray-cray, and you got to get it under control so that people can understand and be united. If people aren't being united, then you're kind of doing your own thing, and it's resulting in division. Well, anyhow, the other part of the Holy Spirit and the speaking in tongues bit is the very presence of God is not far off. The Holy Spirit that Jesus promised that the Father and the Son were going to give is now given because, well, God is present. Now, I'm not saying that this makes everything easy for us, but the Bible, God's book, is constantly telling us that while God seems far off and far away, he is present. The Holy Spirit is the presence of God right here, right now. But the Holy Spirit is doing the same thing that the Father and the Son are doing, and that is uniting people around the magnificent acts of God in their own languages. But God's words need to be heard in everybody's languages. And so God makes it very plain that his words should be in all languages. Christians have taken this very seriously and translated the Bible into their languages, rightfully so. The new part of the Bible was written in Greek so that more people could have access to the languages. The people who wrote the Bible, like Uncle Luke, would have preferred to speak Aramaic or write in Aramaic, most certainly, or, some version of Hebrew or a Semitic language, but they chose Greek because it was too important to the backdrop of what God was doing to get the word out across the language barriers. The miracle that is on view in speaking in tongues is that people are able to hear great things about God in their own language. And so that is also the driving force behind the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues. So we have to always include that in our definition. And for those who would like to say that the apostle, this was something that only the apostles could do, and then once they died, it never happened again. The text doesn't say that. So I'm here to say that I think speaking in tongues, goes on today, but I assume that this is the definition and at least part of the definition that speaking in tongues is. So I'm not going to straighten it all out, but I'm saying that for those of, the Christian groups that are familiar with speaking in tongues, we have to maintain this balance that Uncle Luke gives us, that it's not closed off. It can happen at any point and any time. And it is about languages and overcoming the language barrier so that people can hear, the words of God, the magnificent acts of God in their own language. And so that's the end of the story. That's the big news of the story. Genesis chapter 11 is being reversed so that people everywhere can start hearing and start proclaiming the wonderful acts of God. The Holy Spirit is going to continue doing what Jesus did, and that is uniting people around Jesus, uniting people around the magnificent acts of God, so that we can truly and heartfeltly enjoy God and to love on him and to define ourselves as a group, as people who are gathered by God. The Holy Spirit is the gathering force. When you love God, the Holy Spirit is upon your life. If you hate God, well, you need the Holy Spirit, baby, because the work of the Holy Spirit is to get you to the point where you enjoy God forever and that you hear God's words and start digesting God's viewpoint, in a way that is joyful and fun and exciting and gives you a better perspective on life. And that's what we're all here for, the Biblical Channel, for. That's what we do. We want to see people uniting around God's words, having fun with it, and enjoying God forever. That's what's going on. Hopefully this helped. Catch you next time when Uncle Peter gives a big talk.